If you're going to be wrong with confidence. That is my new favorite quote. Now I know why I've been confident all these years. That explains a lot. So I'm wondering this morning, are you a well individual? Could you say with confidence, I am a well individual? And just on the slight potential that you are not, if someone posed the question to you, do you want to get well? How would you respond to that? How would you respond to the question, do you want to get well? Now, we might immediately think in physical terms. You might think also of emotional and spiritual terms as well, because we're going to explore all of the above this morning. I'm thinking back to January the 15th, 1988. That is a date that will always stand out in my mind. There's not many dates that you remember, especially as the years go by. I was 25 years old at the time. But it stands out for a reason. I was asked to go visit a man in the hospital who was taking chemotherapy. And I think during that time period, it wasn't at all uncommon for someone who was taking chemotherapy to be admitted on an inpatient basis. And so I'd asked if I'd go up and see this man, perhaps pray with him. And so it's Friday, the 15th of January, 1988. It was a Friday, it's mid-morning. I'm thinking more about the weekend activities more than anything else. So I ran up to the third floor at the hospital there in Wichita Falls, and I went to see this man who was very pale and gaunt, and it was obvious that chemotherapy had taken a toll on his body. And as I talked to him, it was like I was sort of punching a ticket. There really wasn't much empathy. There wasn't much genuine concern for what he was experiencing. And so I just took it lightly. I would even use the term flippant in terms of my attitude. And as I look back at that Friday morning, I'm not even sure that I took the time and the effort to pray with this man. So I left the hospital that day, not even aware that I had no business visiting the hospital because I was not a well individual. I was not well in the sense that I was full of arrogance and certainly lacking in empathy. Definitely not a well individual. Everything, however, changed the next day. I was involved in an accident the next day on the 16th of January, got a nice ride to the ER there at the same hospital. I had fractured my pelvis and had the distinct privilege of being hospitalized inpatient in the same hospital, not on the third floor, but one floor up. I was on the fourth floor for 5 days. Suddenly, I'm on the receiving end instead of the giving end of this whole hospital thing, and my attitude had quite the change. And my level of empathy for those who want to get well changed significantly. When you fracture your pelvis, did you know that you're not even able to put your own jeans on? And you certainly can't put your boots on or tie a pair of shoes. And I was on crutches for just over 3 months. And so if you had asked me any time during that 3-month period, John, do you want to get well? And I would say, of course I do. I want to put my own jeans on. I want to get well, and I certainly want to feel better. I certainly want to do the things physically that I could do prior to fracturing my pelvis. So we're going to delve into that very issue this morning. It does not want to change. Let's see if it's on, and it's not changed. Dan, I'll get you to change it for me. Okay, I'll get you to change the slide for me. John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. In previous chapter, there's been some other healing moments, but we're going to focus on one particular healing this morning that Jesus participates in, one of his miraculous signs. And I'm going to read all 15 verses, and as I have done in past weeks as we are working our way through the Gospel of John, I'm going to ask you to listen or perhaps to read along if you so choose in a certain way, to be really attentive to the message of this narrative. I want you to imagine, as we read this story, that you are there, that you're present. And in particular, or more specifically, I want you to imagine you are a particular character, Perhaps as we look at the healing of a person who was an invalid, imagine that you are also an invalid. Maybe imagine that you are paralyzed and unable to be mobile in a normal, healthy way. So imagine you're an invalid too, just like the man described in this story. And so try to hear this event, this encounter this man has with Jesus. Try to hear it as if you were that person. Or you could hear the story as just someone who's a bystander. You just happen to be there. And you're watching these events unfold. You're a healthy person, and you're watching these events unfold. And I'm curious what your heart reaction is to this story. Not necessarily what's going on in your head, what's computing, but instead, what is your heart reaction to this story? John 5, 1 through 15. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 colored colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well? Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." The day in which this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It's the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.' So they asked him, 'Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?' The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, 'See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you.' The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well." Let's go to the next slide and take a look at what we have here. So in the prior chapter, we looked at this incident last Sunday. In John chapter 4, verses 1 through 26, Jesus has an interchange with a woman from Samaria. And one of the things that often goes overlooked in this conversation with this unnamed woman from Samaria is the fact that it was a miraculous discussion. There were things about that woman's life. There were experiences that she had that Jesus was able to relay to her. He knew all about her past. She knew all about the life experiences that she had had. And so there is no way that someone could have said those things unless they had miraculous knowledge regarding her life. So there's a miracle in John chapter 4. And in the next slide, we're going to look at still another one. In John chapter 5, the healing of the royal official's son in John 4, 43 through 54. And so this is this royal official. This is a Roman royal official who entrusts himself to Jesus' care, and his child is miraculously healed. And then we come to John chapter 5, the text that we looked at this morning, the healing of this man at the pool of Bethesda in John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. Let's go to the next slide. When Jesus asked the man if he wanted to get well, how did he respond? We go back to verse 7 that we just read a moment ago. He indicated to Jesus, I have no one to help me in the pool when the water's stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. I think you could interpret his reaction in a lot of different ways. It's possible he's just saying, I'm trying to go with this on my own steam. I don't have anybody who'll help me. You couldn't even look at it that he's making excuses. But after 38 years, can you imagine that maybe this man is somewhat discouraged? That maybe he is feeling a tint of hopelessness about the plight in life he has? So, as one writer says, it might have been that the man had given up hope. Despair had set in. And in his mind, nothing was ever going to change. And so he has this answer to Jesus, oh, nobody can help me. He's just like, I've given up. He's in a state of despair. I'm wondering, in your life experience, not necessarily physically speaking, but I'm thinking more of emotionally and spiritually. If you have experienced chapters in life that feel especially hopeless, to the point that you want to give up hope, to the point that despair sets in deeply. And it's hard to even put one foot in front of the other. And so if someone offers a word of encouragement, comes beside you, it's hard to hear that word of encouragement. And it's almost like your brain is unable to process what someone is conveying to you. There's deep despair. Darkness has enveloped your heart. And so when someone approaches you, and in a way what they're saying is, do you want to get well? And you may or may not have the ability to answer that in the affirmative. Of course I want to get well. Just like when I fractured my pelvis, I was eager. Of course I want to get well, but when it's emotionally and spiritually a little more complicated, is it not? Let's go on to the next slide now. Jesus again asked this man if he wanted to get well. One observation that Chuck Swindoll makes in regard to this passage, he said he looked to humanity to help him with his absurd race for healing, obviously having lost hope of ever seeing God's grace. He's depending on other people who are going to help him in the pool. For him, as for many in our own day, God helps those who help themselves. So I'm a little curious this morning. How many of you grew up hearing that? God helps those who help themselves. My mother used to tell me that on a pretty regular basis. And it was usually used as leverage for guilt. You know, moms are pretty good at that every once in a while, are they not? They use guilt as a motivational factor. God helps those who help themselves. And I was such an ignorant kid, I thought that was in the Bible. I mean, I thought she's quoting Scripture. God helps those who help themselves. I had to break the news this morning. That is not in Scripture. Certainly, God entrusts us with a degree of responsibility. We have responsibilities. He expects us to entrust our very lives to Him. He expects our submission. He expects our surrender to Him. But that idea of God helps those who help themselves, that in the sense that I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this on my own steam, I believe that's what this man who was an invalid was saying in response. Let's go on to the next slide. Think about this even more. So one of the things I've been posing during this series in the Gospel of John, I've been asking two questions every single week, beginning with the first week in January. Two questions. One is, do you believe in Jesus? And more specifically, why do you believe in Jesus? And so today, do you really believe in Jesus who heals? And I'm thinking that in much broader terms than just physical healing. Do you believe in Jesus who heals, period? Do you believe in Jesus who has the capacity to heal physically, to heal emotionally, and even to heal spiritually as well? An all-encompassing capacity to heal. That is the Jesus whom we worship. Do you believe in that Jesus? And secondly, if you believe in Jesus who heals, how does that truth impact your faith? How does that impact your faith even at this very moment. We'll go on to the next thought here. So, same question. And I keep posing the same question because I believe it's a key thought in the whole passage. It's a key thought in this encounter that Jesus has with this man who's been an invalid for some 38 years. So, questions to pose to ourselves. If we truly believe in Jesus who heals, do you want to experience spiritual healing? If you have been wounded spiritually, struggling with who God is, struggling with how he intervenes and works in your life, wondering about life circumstances that you have experienced and wondering, how is God there? And in particular, how is he working in my life? And you just have lots of questions. Maybe even there are some lingering doubts in the back of your mind, and it's caused some real struggles there. And there is a need for pronounced spiritual healing. Do you want to be transformed? Transformed spiritually. In other words, you don't want to be the same person you've always been. You don't want to be that cranky, grouchy person that you've always been. You don't want to be that difficult person that you've always been. You want to be transformed. To use the language of the Apostle Paul in Romans 12, he says we present our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual act of worship. And he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So do you want to experience spiritual transformation? That would be a component of getting well, would it not? And fundamentally, at the end of the day, to just ask yourself, do you want to change? Do you want the status quo to remain, or do you really want to change? Let's go on to the next thought here. Jesus obviously was equally concerned about this man's spiritual state. He healed him. He was no longer an invalid. He had the ability to pick up his mat and walk. But as Jesus sees him at a later time, they have this part of the conversation that's recorded in verse 14. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you're well again. Now stop sinning or something worse may happen to you." So on the surface, it sounds a little harsh. But I think in the broad scope of things, Jesus is saying, I'm concerned about your spiritual state, your spiritual wellness, inasmuch as I am concerned about your physical awareness. And we'll go on to the next one now. Do you want to get well? Do you really want to be changed? I love this quote from William Barclay as he's commenting on this passage in John. He says, in our utmost hearts, we are well content to stay as we are. There can be no change for us. If that's what we're thinking, if we're thinking, I'm kind of content with the status quo, I'm kind of content where I am, and it may not be the best, and I may have some struggles in my life, but even when things are not well, we can remain in a state of sickness, a state of emotional or spiritual sickness, and then we become so accustomed to it. It becomes our norm. It just becomes who we are. It becomes a part of our identity. And so as long as we're well content just to stay there, then there'll never be any change for us. So that fundamental question, do you want to get well, is first and foremost. It's a primary question. It's of great significance. Okay, let's move on still. One more. So the scene by the pool of Bethesda must have been a soul-rending experience for any visitor with a capacity for empathy. So as I read the first 15 verses of John 5 this morning, I asked you, well, could you read it through the lens or hear it through the ears of, I'm another invalid. I'm somebody else who is paralyzed. I'm somebody else with some sort of infirmity, and I'm hearing this story through that experience. Or if you were just an outsider, you're just an observer watching this unfold. And anybody who has any capacity at all for empathy, it must have been a soul-rending experience. So I go back to January the 15th, 1988. I was 25 years old and so full of wisdom at the time and so full of compassion and empathy. And I look back and I think, here I went to see this man who is on the receiving end of chemotherapy. This guy's struggling. His health was really compromised. And I think back to that experience and I conclude, I think my level of empathy for him was a -10. I think I was just thoughtless, careless, maybe even to some degree callous. And after the roles being reversed and having a little humbling experience, one floor up at Bethania Regional Hospital at that time, I had a very different outlook. And you know, every hospital visit I have made since the 15th of January, 1988, I don't know how many there's been, but there's been quite a few. I've never experienced like I did that Friday morning. My level of empathy has increased substantially because I think the Lord has helped me get well. He's helped my heart get well. But I also think of experiences I've had over the years when there was a great opportunity to reach out to someone and to explore their spiritual healing, and I've completely missed the opportunity. I've shared this with the church before. In 1992, encountered this man who was in need of a bus ticket to go to Denton. And in my initial conversation with him, I thought he was not telling me the truth. I thought he was just trying to con us. So I said, well, who sent you over here? And he told me, well, social services at the hospital sent me over. And I thought, you know, I'm just not in the mood today. I'm going to call social services at the hospital, and I'm going to send this guy packing. So I called social services, and I told them who I was. I told them I was on the staff at the Church of Christ downtown. And the lady that was the social worker said, oh, I'm so glad you called. She said, I just sent a man over there who needs a bus ticket to Denton. And I said, oh, really? And she said, oh, I'm so glad I can send him to your church. Your church is always so kind and generous and compassionate. And I said, oh, yes, we are. Of course we are. And I hung the phone up and I tucked my tail. And the last thing she told me is, this man has AIDS. He's dying of AIDS. This was on the part of the AIDS epidemic of that era. Very gaunt, very thin, young man in his 20s. And I told him, I said, we'll walk across the street to the bus station and we'll get you a ticket to Denton. He's going to a treatment center there. And I said, then we'll go to Whataburger and we'll get something to eat. I think it was the right choice to make, but an area I failed miserably that morning. Could have had a discussion about his spiritual wellness. And I think I was so wrapped up in my own little world, and again, probably wrapped up to some degree in my own callous heart because I thought he was lying to me initially. I failed to have a conversation that could have led to some spiritual wellness for this poor young man who was dying of AIDS. Let's go on to the next one and let's think about this a little bit more. So, put all caps, do you want to get well? Do you really want to be changed, or are you just comfortable in your pain? Is it possible that your heart is stubborn? Paul alludes to that in Romans chapter 2, verse 5, and he also uses the term unrepentant. And so if we want to experience spiritual wellness or spiritual healing, if you will, we're going to have to give up that stubborn heart, and furthermore, we're going to have a heart that is not unrepentant, but instead is a very penitent, contrite heart. And let's go on to the next one now. You'll see this in your printed handout this morning, these quotes. I want to share a couple of quotes from this printed handout. And the handout article says, Jesus may be asking us, do you really want to be healed and transformed? A spiritual cure would also have life-changing consequences. Freedom from spiritual infirmity would bring the expectation of becoming holy, self-controlled servants of God. And then the thought still continues. The base of our spiritual network would no longer be others caught up in the dark world of sin. We have to decide if being spiritually whole is really worth the upheaval this radical transformation would create in our lives. You've got that in print this morning you can take with you. And I think it'll be a great basis to reflect on this passage in John 5 a little bit later this week. Let's go on to the next one. So, a word of assurance, and coupled with this passage in John, I want to also incorporate an incident that's recorded in the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, verses 40 and 42. Love this story. It's such a powerful story. And it's a word of assurance because Jesus simply says, so in verse 40, a man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And the response of Jesus, filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. Touched a man with leprosy. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Let's move on. So, key questions, and I'll go through these quickly. I'll give you some time back next week. Do you believe in Jesus who heals? And the follow-up question, how does that truth impact your faith? Perhaps this week you could visualize Jesus asking you, do you want to get well? And an appropriate follow-up, visualize Jesus also saying to you, I am willing. I am willing. We'll move on. We're going to have a time of invitation. And I'd like to pause just for a moment and ask our elders, those who shepherd the church here, if y'all would be willing to stand where you are seated. As Nathan makes his way up to lead our invitation song, here's our shepherds. Look around. As you think about the need for healing and pose the question to yourself, do I want to get well? These individuals would love to have the opportunity to embrace you, to pray on your behalf, and to be a source of encouragement to you. Let's sing our song of invitation this morning.